World Heroes is a one-on-one fighter developed by Alpha Denshi and released in 1992 for the arcades and Neo Geo. The plot centers on a scientist named Dr. Brown who uses a time machine to summon fighters from different eras of history to determine who is the greatest combatant. Many of the fighters are based on real-life figures like Bruce Lee, Joan of Arc, and Hulk Hogan. The final opponent, Gigas, resembles the T-1000 and he has the ability to morph into any of the other fighters. In addition, several of the fighters bore similarities to the characters in Street Fighter II in terms of their moveset. World Heroes has a choice of 2 fighting modes. In normal mode, you take on the other opponents in their respective settings all over the world, and standard best 2 out of 3 matches. There's the deathmatch mode, which is the defining feature of this series. It's the best 2 out of 3 like in normal mode, but this time the fights take place in wrestling rings or arenas laid out with hazards like spike walls, electric ring ropes, and landmines. World Heroes employed an attack scheme where the strength of punches and kicks were determined by whether the buttons were tapped or pressed, similar to the pressure pad system used in the original Street Fighter, plus another button for throws. The fast attack speed of some of the characters made combos fairly easy to execute. World Heroes was one of many arcade fighters during the early 90s ported to home consoles. Ports were released for the Super NES and Sega Genesis, so now we'll take a look at the Super NES version. The Super Nintendo port of World Heroes was released in 1993 and was handled by Sunsoft, who would go on to develop Galaxy Fight and Waku Waku 7 for the Neo Geo. In this port, you have the option of using the 3-button attack scheme like the arcade version, or use a 6-button scheme which has separate buttons for weak and strong punches and kicks, which is a welcoming feature. The deathmatch mode was renamed Fatal Match, though all content in that mode remains intact. In Versus mode, both players can play as the same character, which was not possible in the Neo Geo version, though you can do this in a single-player game. The characters control fairly well, and special moves and combos are not difficult to pull off. I noticed that dizzying your opponent is easier in this port, and combos can re-dizzy your opponent, making the matches very one-sided. Taking advantage of this tactic can make the game a breeze. Outside of using that tactic, the Super NES version of World Heroes is easier than the arcade. Compared to the arcade, the graphics are colorful, though there are minor background details missing. There are noticeable background animations that were absent. For example, in Rasputin's stage, the gears do not animate, and in Julius Karn's stage, the clouds do not move. Also, the foreground scrolling is absent in this port. Here's a quick comparison to the Neo Geo version so you can see for yourself. There is compression in the resolution, but it still maintains the look very well. As with most console ports for its time, there are missing frames of animations for the characters, though they still move fluidly. The color of the blood was changed to white to tone down the violence. Most of the voices are present in this port. The voice pitch is fairly accurate, though they sound faded. The music fares well, which has that standard Super NES beat to it. The bonus stage where you destroy the falling pots was left out. Instead, you do the boulder carving stage twice. The character-specific endings are present, and you get the extended ending even if you don't complete the game in one credit. Overall, I have to say that the Super NES version of World Heroes is a quality port and captures the arcade look and feel very well. Now let's take a side-by-side look at the Neo Geo and Super NES port. Here is the Sega Genesis port, which was released in 1994 and developed by Sega Midwest Studio Division. In this version, you can fight against a clone of yourself in both a 1 and 2 player game. The Genesis version also takes advantage of the 6-button controller, which allows for separate buttons for weak and strong attacks. But unfortunately, that is the only positive feature about the controls. There is lag in the button input and movement feels choppy. Some special moves are very difficult to pull off. There are serious hit detection issues as well. You can take damage from attacks even if you're not within range. There were times where I took damage for no reason. I found no real strategy in each fight, I simply button mashed away. Dizzying your opponent feels like a random occurrence rather than when a well-placed combo is executed. The final battle with Gigas can be cheap depending on the character you're using. Throws are ineffective against him. You're limited to 3 continues like in the Neo Geo AES version. Graphically, the Genesis port isn't as colorful as the Super NES or Neo Geo versions, but still retains a solid look. It does have the foreground scrolling and some background animations not found in the Super NES port like the examples I used earlier. Unfortunately, there is choppiness when the screen scrolls. The animations for grab attacks look very sloppy. Occasionally, the burning and electrocution animations are not done if you come in contact with the ring ropes. Not all of the deathmatch arenas in this port are present, and for the ones that are, they do not all properly correspond to the arcade version based on the characters. For example, the fight against Brocken is supposed to be in the arena with spiked walls, not flaming ring ropes. The fight against Gigas takes place in his outer space stage in deathmatch mode. Blood is not present in this port either, and it's replaced with small explosion effects. Like in the Super NES port, the Falling Pots bonus stage is missing. There are no character-specific endings in this port. You get an ending where a statue is erected for the winner with some fireworks. The announcer voices are missing, and the other voices and grunts have static, some of which do not match up correctly to the arcade version. For example, Rasputin, Hanzo, and Fuma all use Kim Dragon's death groan. Overall, this is a sorry excuse of a port that feels like a cheap bootleg rather than a legitimate arcade port. Don't bother with this version. So let's see the side-by-side comparison of the arcade and Sega Genesis port of World Heroes. To wrap things up, we're going to take a look at all 3 versions of World Heroes. Between the two 16-bit home console ports, the Super Nintendo version wins by a landslide. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, thanks for watching.
Alright.